Well, thank you very much for having me here this evening. It is truly an honor to be with you at the University of Illinois. I appreciate the invitation, and I thank Dan Barker for being here this evening as well. Our subject this evening is very, very important. Dan and I were noting that this is not the first time that we have met. In fact, we met a long time ago on the Tom Leykis show in Phoenix, Arizona. And one thing that we both immediately noticed is that both of us had a whole lot more hair than we do today. And the irony, of course, of that is the fact that that indicates that time is passing. And that passage of time indicates that we debate this evening on the precipice of eternity. None of us know what tomorrow will bring. Therefore, what we are debating should not be a mere intellectual exercise for anyone this evening. From the Christian worldview, we are speaking about the very issues of life itself. The audience tonight, those who are here in the auditorium, those who will be listening later by recording, you are the ones who cannot be neutral about the subject that we are looking at this evening. You are the judges of the debate. And please keep in mind, even though we live in a postmodern paradigm today, postmodernism does not encourage deep critical thought. It often confuses emotion with truth, feelings with logic. I hope you will listen very carefully to the presentations as they are made this evening. I would like to challenge everyone in the audience to examine your own worldview this evening. Let this be a beginning, not an end for you. Examine your worldview. Examine it for consistency. Test the debaters. Test Mr. Barker and myself as to who is consistent with their own worldview. Who will have to borrow from the other's worldview? Which worldview will accord with the reality that we find around us? Those are some of the questions we must ask this evening. Now, the biblical teaching is that everyone listening to this debate knows that the God of Scripture lives. This knowledge may not be explicit in the sense of being able to articulate the Trinity, for example, but it is fundamental to our debate this evening to understand why a Christian believes this to be the case and why it is relevant to our encounter. Mr. Barker has said that he knows the Christian God does not exist. He will often tell us that morality, by definition, refers to behavior that minimizes harm. Mr. Barker has a naturalistic, materialist worldview that causes him to think and reason in a particular fashion. We will examine the consistency of his ability to be able to offer such definitions later on. But for now, I must define the biblical view before we can examine it for consistency. We read in the Christian scriptures, "For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who are suppressing," present tense, "the truth by means of unrighteousness. For that which is known about God is evident within them, because God has made it evident to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened." Now, please notice that men know God exists, but due to their sin and rebellion, they suppress this knowledge. The revelation of God in creation, both outwardly and inwardly, is sufficient to render man accountable to God, to give thanks and to give honor. The clarity of this revelation renders all men unapologetus, that is, without an apologetic. This means that Mr. Barker will not be able to argue against the God who has placed clear evidence of his existence in and all around Mr. Barker. Oh, but wait, surely he will do so. Yes, he will try, but here is one of the keys to the debate. Will Mr. Barker be able to do this without borrowing from God's existence to do so? I submit he will not. As hard as Dan has tried for over 25 years now, his suppression of the knowledge of God leads inevitably to utter futility and self-contradiction. The biblical worldview places the Triune God at the center of all things. As the Creator, his purpose, his decree, his intention determines the meaning, purpose, and identity of all things, including man. To truly know things as they are in God's created order, man cannot put himself in the center of the diagram, demoting God to just one other fact of knowledge. Instead, to know truly and properly, mankind must see himself as a creature in his Creator's world, and hence must know things only as they are related to God. To have true, proper knowledge, then, I must know the creation only as I relate to the Creator. When I know law or morality or love or history as it is properly defined by the Creator, as I see these in light of the Triune God's eternal decree, then I have true and proper knowledge of these things. When man is placed in the center, as is necessary in a naturalistic materialist worldview, all things become objects of human knowledge defined by the creature, including God. Man, by definition, has to define God in a way that fits his own role in the universe. Further, the unity, harmony, and consistency of knowledge that comes from having the Triune God at the center, his sovereign his sovereign decree defining the creation, is lost, and each man or woman becomes the ultimate authority in defining reality. Now, the thesis statement specifically refers to the Triune God. Why the Triune God? First and foremost, because the Trinity is biblical. I know Mr. Barker does not believe that, but I'd be happy to respond to any objections he might raise to that. Secondly, because of the centrality of Christ to the Christian worldview. Specifically, I refer to, for example, this text from the book of Colossians. For by him all things were created. This is referring to Jesus. Both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now, this is a radical claim. Certainly, it is the Christian message that the Creator himself, to bring about his own glory and the salvation of an undeserving people, entered into his own creation in the person of Jesus Christ. This means that there are no neutral facts. There is no neutral ground upon which to stand. A fact, if it is a fact, is so because God made it to be so. To pretend otherwise is to compromise the Christian faith. That means I insist that when Dan Barker seeks to reason logically while denying his Creator, he is not only in self-denial, he has to borrow from my worldview to make it work. While Mr. Barker does not believe he has to give a justification for the laws of logic, I leave it to the listener to decide if such vital matters can be left to mere brute facts, saying, well, that's just the way that it is. When a consistent biblical Christian presents the all-encompassing claims of Christianity in debate with most atheists, including Dan Barker, the atheist assumes that since we do not start with theistic proofs, which invite the creature to judge God and which ignore the suppression of the knowledge of God already present in the unbeliever, that we have abandoned the use of evidence and that we are simply presupposing the truth of Christianity. This is simply not the case. I am saying everything that is true is because God created it. Hence, all evidence points to God, and that is why the unbeliever has to work so hard at suppressing the knowledge. Further, I am not suggesting that you simply presuppose Christianity. The issue has to do with the presuppositions one brings to all the data and the myth that anyone is epistemologically and morally neutral about the existence of God. Now, a few years ago, Dan Barker made the following claim. He said, quote, however, when it comes to a particular definition of God, such as the Christian God or the Islamic God, I go further than just the negative, soft, lowercase atheism, and I make the positive claim that that particular God does not exist. In that case, I am an uppercase atheist, especially when it comes to the gods of the revealed religions. I am convinced, and I claim to know, that those gods, the Christian God, Allah, does not exist. It is not a belief, it is a claim of knowledge. Such a God does not exist. This means Dan is a hard atheist, a capital A atheist in our debate this evening. So how does one decide between these two positions? Well, there's a good question. First of all, I would suggest through the demonstration of the consistency of one's own worldview. One must demonstrate the consistency of one's own worldview. One must ground logic, reason, etc., in one's own worldview. Secondly, by providing an internal critique of competing worldviews. And finally, through the demonstration of the explanatory power of one's worldview in light of known reality. Now, I refer this as secondary evidence. It is not primary evidence, but it is relevant to the topic that we have this evening. So you see, the reason we must approach this issue presuppositionally can be seen by recognizing the impossibility of demonstrating God's existence to a dogmatic materialist like Dan Barker. From a Christian perspective, Dan has no right to climb up upon the seat of judgment, wrap the robes of the cosmic jurist around himself, and act as judge. For when anyone brings evidence before Judge Barker of the existence of anything outside the materialistic realm, he simply bangs the gavel and says, evidence dismissed. So we are left with the impossible task of demonstrating the existence of a non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material being, while being limited only to spatial, temporal, and material evidence. The impossibility of the task and the circularity of the position is obvious. Further, while Mr. Barker sits as judge, as a materialist, and as a functionalist who denies the existence of the laws of logic as abstract and universal entities reflecting the order of the creation, he can only offer us, as his ultimate authority, his own cognitive processes, his own mind. I would like to argue that Mr. Barker lost the debate tonight by walking in the room. His expectation that we can engage in logic-based rational dialogue in a random world where the laws of logic are no more than the result of the action of the sodium-potassium pumps inside layers of phospholipids inside the bony structure that comprises Mr. Barker's head makes no sense given his naturalistic materialism. Indeed, Mr. Barker assures us that the laws of logic are no more universal or abstract than digestion in the stomach, a confusion of categories that is truly stunning. But Mr. Barker's functionalism must be his final authority, so he cannot give us any higher justification for any answer he may give us than this. The neurons in his brain say so, for now anyway. Atoms banging around, electrical impulses and axons, nothing more. In fact, in a debate with Paul Manata, Dan admitted that, in the cosmic perspective, humans are no more important than broccoli, resulting in a fascinating discussion of cosmic broccoli. The point, of course, is that the debate we are having this evening is really absurd from a materialistic perspective. One piece of cosmic broccoli arguing with another when there is no transcendent reality, no laws of logic binding upon both, no truths that remain valid and important long after the cosmic broccoli has become part of the cosmic salad, is the ultimate example of futility. The fact that we all sit here this evening expecting rational discourse that follows the laws of logic is to be expected on Christian grounds. It is as silly as the invasion of the cosmic broccoli from the materialist perspective. Now, let's look at solid, strong evidence of the existence of the Triune God, not as a neutral fact from which I suggest we reason to God, but as a fact of reality that can only make sense in light of God's existence, and as a fact that will illustrate the materialist unwillingness to allow for conclusions that challenge their worldview. What you see on the screen right now is here we have what is called F1 ATPase. It is a structure found in living cells in the mitochondria. It is a vital structure in cellular respiration. For by it, ADP, adenosine diphosphate, is converted back into ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the universal power source of most bodily systems. Through an ingenious system, it uses ionic flow to create mechanical power, very similar to the turbines we use to generate hydroelectric power. As the mechanism turns, powered by proton movement across a gradient, it moves highly specific protein molecules, molecules that have to have a very specific ordered shape that, due to their motion, attach a phosphate molecule to ADP, reconstituting ATP, which is then utilized by the body. Not only is the complexity beautiful, but it is so plainly purposeful, so plainly designed, that no one can possibly see this as a mere result of the movement of atoms over time. Remember, this is just one of the many cellular organelles that are basic to life itself. We can't hope for natural selection to explain how something this grand came into existence. It is far beyond the technology found, for example, in my BlackBerry Storm over on my table over there, or the cell phone that you have with you, and far beyond anything that we can do even with our most advanced technology today. Here we have a tremendously simplified graphic of protein synthesis in the cell using DNA, RNA polymerase, messenger RNA, transfer RNA, ribosomes, etc. Again, the complexity of this mechanism is mind-boggling. This is not, as Mr. Barker has erroneously claimed in the past, similar to complex crystals or wind-shaped sand dunes. No, this is specific informational complexity on a level that rivals our best computers and on a physical scale so infinitesimal we are left in awestruck wonder every time we look into our own selves. Amazingly, Mr. Barker can look at this clear informational complexity and tell us that this is not evidence of an intelligent, wise designer. This is nothing more than the report one would make after a storm has passed through. What can explain such a willingness to reject such obvious evidence of purposeful, intentional, and intelligent design? There have been recent developments. One recent book that came out last year that is quite fascinating is entitled Why Us by James LeFanu. And he addresses what has happened since the decade of the brain and the Human Genome Project. And I thought this was very relevant to our debate this evening. He wrote, "Nonetheless, there must be a reason why those genome projects prove so uninformative about the form and attributes of living things, or why the decade of the brain should have fallen so far short of explaining the mind. There is a powerful impression that science has been looking in the wrong place, seeking to resolve questions whose answers lie somehow outside its domain." He continues by saying, "This is not just a matter of science not yet knowing all the facts. Rather, there is the sense that something of immense importance is missing that might transform the bare bones of genes into the wondrous diversity of the living world and the monotonous electrical firing of the neurons of the brain into the vast spectrum of sensations and ideas of the human mind. What might that missing element be?" One of the tragedies of modern Western academia has been the institutional establishment of a religious dogma that brooks no dissent, that being neo-Darwinian naturalistic materialism. These vital questions cannot even be asked by the dogmatic materialist. The answer must be in the genes. There can't be something different about mankind that gives rise to the mind. We have to be just like a tapeworm or like broccoli. Our religion says so. Long ago, Blaise Pascal, the brilliant mathematician and philosopher, said, "Reason's last step is the recognition that there are an infinite number of things which are beyond it. It is merely feeble if it does not go as far as to realize that." And reflecting those same thoughts, the Puritan John Flavel said, "I know there is nothing in the word or in the works of God that is repugnant to sound reason, but there are some things in both which are opposite to carnal reason, as well as above right reason. And therefore our reason never shows itself more unreasonable than in summoning those things to its bar which transcend its sphere and capacity." Now, I want to be very, very clear on one thing this evening. While our debate places you, the audience, in the position of judging, I would be remiss in a most severe way if I did not reject in the strongest possible terms the idea that we as creatures have the right to judge the existence of our Creator. The verdict of this debate was given when God said, "Let there be light." The issue tonight is whether we will live in accord with that verdict or not. So what is the reality in our closing moments of this opening statement? If your worldview cannot give a justification for why we are here tonight, laws of logic, reason, transcendent meaning, it should be rejected. If your worldview cannot accord with the reality of the world and human existence, it should be rejected. The Triune God, as the timeless, unchanging creator of all things, gives meaning through his eternal decree to all things in space and time. We as creatures find our truest selves only when we are in the proper relationship to our Creator, so that our intellectual pursuits are undertaken under his lordship, where we as creatures have the tremendous privilege of thinking God's thoughts after him. This is the great irony of those who promote what they call free thought. Creatures who rebel against their own nature and who embrace dogmatic materialism are not free at all. They are bound to self-deception and as such are condemned to anything but free thought. Their worldview precludes a true, holistic, harmonious knowledge of God's creation around them. The Christian, however, is seeing himself or herself for what we are in reality, the creatures of a personal, eternal sovereign, can, from the peace that comes through faith in Jesus Christ, experience the fullness of our humanity as God intended us to, all to his glory. Thank you very much.